Hi, everyone. Welcome to Workflow Optimization, the next frontier in healthcare. This is a BPM Plus Health virtual event that we organized this week with sessions and demos that we had planned for the HIMSS 20 conference, which unfortunately was canceled. My name is Tracy Berardi, Program Manager of BPM Plus Health. This happens to be our third session of this two-day virtual event. And this session is titled PHQ-9 Automatable Guidelines. That's Patient Health Questionnaire 9 Automatable Guidelines. And the speakers joining me this afternoon are Denis Gagne from Trisotech and Dr. Steve Hasley, CMIO of BPM Plus Health, formerly ACOG, who's been authoring these clinical guidelines. In the chat box, there's a link to our schedule of events. So this is our final event for today, but tomorrow, Thursday, March 12th, afternoon Eastern time, we have 5 more sessions, back to back, that you're welcome to join. We are capturing the recordings and we'll be posting them at that same link URL location. We'll have plenty of time for questions, so if anything strikes you, go ahead and use the questions tab in the toolbar, and we'll address those. And why don't I go ahead and turn the presentation over to Denis and Steve. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Tracy. Hi, I'm Denis Gagne from Trisotech. I'm here with.
Hi, I'm Steve Hasley.
So we're both here to present on the topic of PHQ-9 and more particularly automatable guidelines for PHQ-9. Originally, this presentation was meant as a short presentation and demo within the VA's pod at the HIMSS conference. So you'll see a little bit of that into that demo and the context. So let me start talking about our overarching goal here. The real goal of all this work here is to disambiguate clinical guidelines. Narrative clinical guidelines tend to be quite verbose and lead to many different interpretations, sometimes are very dependent on the writer and the writer's style, or the group of writers and the group of writers' style. And this may lead to different action or reaction within the care providing context. So our goal here is to help in disambiguating these clinical guidelines. To do so, we use what's called shareable clinical pathways. And shareable clinical pathways are basically visual workflow and decision models that are both human readable and machine automatable. So a single knowledge artifact that can be used by the clinicians to read and interpret the guideline in a very clear and unambiguous way. And also by the machine, the model can be consumed by the machine to be automated. So to do so, we are relying on a set of international open standards called BPM Plus. BPM Plus is a family of standards that address these particular concerns through formal expression languages, so we can visually capture or depict the activities of the workflow and the logic of the decision, so that these diagrams, these pictures of the workflow and the logic are very unambiguous visually to the practitioners, but also can be interpreted in a single unified way by the machine. So we're really promoting here this unambiguous visual notation to reach this goal. So we're using 3 various standards within the BPM Plus community of health standards. So these standards are provided by the Object Management Group. You have the URL at the bottom of the slides there. And these open standards are machine interpretable models. So the models come from that aspect, and they're based on unambiguous graphical notation or visual languages. So the notation comes in. So the moniker always ending with the MN model annotation. So the first one we have is BPMN for the business process model annotation. And BPMN is really there to help us capture process diagrams or workflow diagrams and gives us a general overarching of the flow of treatment or the flow of logic that the guidelines would normally present in a narrative way. There's also another standard called CMMN for case management model annotation. And CMMN is really more for the unstructured type of processes where things are emerging as the context and the time goes. So different events come in that we have to react to. So CMMN is more about how a subject matter expert or a knowledge worker can react within this context to all these different events. So a good example of this would be a personalized patient care where it is really specific to the patient individual that we have in front of us. And then we have the DMN standard that stands for decision model annotation. And as the name kind of allude to, DMN is there to capture decisions and the logic of decisions. So what are the requirements for that decision to take place, and what is the logic under which that decision can take place? So one of the very leading elements of DMN are decision tables, but there's also all kinds of other logical equations that can be constructed with DMN. So these three standards, BPMN, CMMN, and DMN, are what we call BPM Plus in general. There are other standards that come into play, but these are the main leading standards that we are using. And we are using all these standards within a community of practice called BPM Plus Health. And BPM Plus Health is a community of practice that looks at promoting the usage of these standards, both to vendors, different professional association. So we look at aspects like authoring, standardizing, and vendors' implementation of these standards within the community. And we certainly invite you to join the BPM Plus Health community that you can find at bpm-plus.org. So all these things come together to support the interoperability goals that we have in modern healthcare information technology environment. So we apply these techniques to guidelines to use these formal language to ensure this unambiguous result that we're looking for. So we promote sharing and the promulgation of clinical knowledge via these open standards. We enhance the consumption of these various knowledge assets by encapsulating them in a way that can be consumed from any platform, anywhere. And we also promote the advance of process interoperability in different care setting and institution. So the solution to this here is to look at how using PHQ-9, the Patient Health Questionnaire 9 questions, to screen for depression. And we can scale this approach to multiple vendors' implementation in a consistent way across any EHR or health system. So we will demonstrate how data can be collected from different instantiation of these services and aggregate for analysis, and that are aligning with the ONC goals to promote data interoperability. And to illustrate the pathway, we'll use clinical decision elements and process that will do the recognition of this assessment and treatment plan using the PHQ-9 context. So I will now pass it on to Steve Hasley, who will talk about the PHQ-9 context.
Thanks, Denis. Wonderful to be able to talk to all of you today. Sorry we're not down in sunny Orlando, at least most of us. But thank you for being with us today and sharing some of your busy schedule. So what's the goal of this? Now, if you operate in a big system and have a big iron EHR, it's possible that it already has the PHQ-9 built in, and that's a wonderful thing. And so you can use the PHQ-9 in your clinical setting, and away you go. But what if you're using a EHR that doesn't have the PHQ-9 built in? Or what if you'd like to have the PHQ as a mobile application, or something you can serve up to patients, maybe in the waiting room on a tablet? Do you want to code this over and over again? Probably not. So what we've done is taken that standardized screening questionnaire and encoded it in the BPMN framework, as Denis has described, so that it's available wherever, however you want it, basically. And just to go over the background on this, of course, most of you know that depression is a very common problem in America. It accounts for a lot of the cost and the resources in healthcare. And PHQ-9 has been out for many, many years, a way to screen people for depression. This is a recommendation that is widely encouraged, not only among the veterans, but basically, I think, to large populations as just a standard of good preventative health these days. So PHQ-9 was an easy thing to pick on. Plus, it's freely available. We didn't have to run into a lot of proprietary issues with it. Next slide. There we go. So we took the questionnaire, and of course it has a scoring system that we'll show you in a minute, and modeled this in the BPM as the user about whether they're suicidal. And if you're suicidal, everything else stops. Oh my God, that's something that requires immediate intervention right now, right this second. Drop what you're doing and get this patient to a psychiatric ER, okay? And then if you're in between, you're in between, and there are different levels of what you might do as a provider based on those scores. And the other advantage of this centralized model is that you get to keep all the responses up in a cloud database, so that for further analysis, you can take a look at this and you can see how people are answering, what questions seem to go up and down, or whatever questions you'd like to ask. You have all the data that's available there. Next slide. So here's just a very simple BPMN model. Starts with the circle over here on the left-hand side. The PHQ-9 questions are the input. The evaluation happens here, and the results are the output. Then there's a decision right away: is the patient suicidal? If so, boom, get immediate consultation. And otherwise, you score the responses, and it could be minimal, mild, moderate, or moderate to severe. And there are different actions to be carried out depending on the severity of the depression. And that's demonstrated here with the different endpoints over at the far right. Next slide. And here's just an example of the decision model that we use. here's the questions or the data input at the bottom. And the first decision, as we showed before, is the patient suicidal? Hey, that's a different ball of wax. But if so, you calculate the score, and then you use the score as the input to the severity issue. And that's what's shown right here. The scores being from less than 1 would be 0 up to 27. And that gives you the severity here. And this is based on the scoring system of the questionnaire. So that's how that decision part works. Next slide. So we've been able to take this and working with Denis and the good folks at Trisotech, actually turn this not only to a graphical model, as we showed you a couple of slides ago, but we've turned this into an executable model. This is available on an open API. You can hit this URL. You can go through the procedure. You can get the recommendations, and it's available very easily to either be integrated into an EHR or as a standalone application. And that's, I think, what's really the breakthrough part of this. This means you can screen through multiple modalities, and the application is portable. It's not something that has to be customized and concreted into your existing instance of your EHR. Future plans. Well, I can speak for the OBGYN stuff. We've done over 100 models for antenatal care, various aspects of that. And right now, really just delivering those to a vendor as schematics or blueprints. But we hope to be able to advancing this into models that are actually executable, as the one we're going to show you in a second here, so that the applicability of these is a lot wider than just being tied to one vendor. And I think the other thing that's so important, really the 800-pound gorilla, is that when you do this, when you execute these in a cloud-based platform like this, then you get all the data. Now, yes, I understand there's HIPAA issues and privacy issues and whatnot, and we don't want to be, keeping or certainly not disclosing, but in the aggregate de-identified, this data is a tremendously rich resource for people who want to do this kind of analysis, for people who want to make recommendations, see which recommendations work, because it carries that whole flow of the patient, of the arc of care through the process, and lets you see it at various points what's going on with the patient. Archiving of the data, to me, is really the big payoff. I'm going to turn things back to Denis right now, and he's going to show you a demo of how this actually works, and then we'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Steve. So this example is simple, but that's the power of this example, is that it can clearly capture the power of everything that is possible within this approach here, as promoted by the BPM Plus Health community. So as Steve mentioned earlier, the BPMN model here is depicted. Now, the beauty of BPMN is that BPMN is an open international standard. Any software vendor that is adherent or compliant to the standard can use and exchange these diagrams, these models with one another. And so any healthcare system that connect to these can also exchange and receive these models. And that's the power of this approach. So here in BPMN, very simple, we start here. The first task is to do a PHQ-9 evaluation, which is the scoring. And this particular task is defined with a decision model. And in the decision model, the structure is quite simple. The oval shape are the inputs, and the rectangles are the decisions. So based on the 9 questions inputs, we can also decide the PHQ score of a person. And once we have the PHQ score of a person, we can decide on the severity level. And for example, this particular severity depression level is represented by a table according to the PHQ-9 approach that can categorize according on the score, gives you a category of level of depression. So these are very clear specification of the details, the behavior, the logic there. There's no ambiguity to its interpretation. So once we have that result score, then based on that branch to the appropriate branch and do the appropriate action. So for example, with mild depression, we'll consider a care physician. So all these elements are very specific, and the logic by human because you can visually read it. And studies after studies have shown that people, when it comes to explaining how things get done, revolve to 2 modes primarily. One is such a flow diagram as we're showing there, and the other one is a to-do list. So this approach is very meaningful to humans when we're looking at them and reading them. We can interpret that this with the knowledge of 4 simple symbols. The circle are always event, the rounded shape are task, and the diamonds are decision points. And that's all you need to read these diagrams. So now this diagram, the beauty of it is this knowledge artifact. This model is also the documentation, the narrative of the guidelines. So if I go here and I press to generate the report, out of this same diagram, I can obtain the narrative for PHQ-9 with all the details explaining each one of the steps, each one of the decision, the various inputs, and what they mean, and what are the variables that are used within that context. So we have narrative documentation along with the model, and we can also use this model to basically, in a multimedia interactive way, navigate through the flow of the logic and do the various steps as we're going through. So a single knowledge artifact is the model for human consumption, is the documentation via the narrative that is generated. It's a multimedia explanation of how things should get done. And it is also the code that can be executed. Because behind all these shapes, there's a specific machine behavior that is specified so that an engine that can read or is compliant to BPMN, CMMN, and DMN can execute these diagrams in a rigorous and repeatable way. So each engine will redo that behavior over and over in any engine from any vendors. So what we've done is created out of this model, we can generate a decision service or a workflow service. And these are microservices that can be containerized and scale to the level of your desire. So each service is provided with a web interface where this is generated on the fly from the logic of the model. And because of the specification of the possible answers to all the questions, the tool can render on the fly a form that covers this. The tools also generate on the fly a REST API for the service. So this is a fully documented REST API that you can actually execute and try here with a fully documented environment, execute it here. So from a machine point of view, you have all the documentation for the REST API that you need to consume it from any application that you want to call this from. There's also an open API file that is generated on the fly, and this open API file is based on Swagger, and this gives you a machine readable definition of all the inputs and outputs of that service. So you can do automated discovery from your application to recognize the service and implement it. So all these different endpoints are exposed and can be consumed for that service. So now, interestingly enough, now I can go and consume this from this web form service. So I'll just enter any kind of answers without necessarily making a lot of sense. And I'll say here, not at all, I'm not suicidal. So therefore, when the service runs, it returns that I am not suicidal and that my depression is moderate, and that the next step should be to monitor, support, and offer education and refer to primary physician. And once that's done, once I refer to the primary physician, then I'm ending in the state of adding depression to the patient problem list. So I've basically stepped through this. I answered my questions, got scored. I was not found to be suicidal, so I moved on to here. Then after that, I had moderate depression, so it was monitor and refer to the primary care physician, and I ended up into adding depression to my patient problem list. So this is the steps, this is the flow that this quick execution of the form did here. Now, I can, and as Steve mentioned, whatever I answer here, if I say that several days I'm thinking about hurting myself, and I run this service, right away, the PHQ-9 evaluation is that I'm suicidal with a mild depression because of the answers I've provided. And the end result is I should get immediate psychological consultation. Again, flowing through here, recognize that I was suicidal, said, yes, you're moderate, but we got to take care of you right away. So another thing that we did here to show the flexibility of this approach is in the context of the demo for the VA at IMSS for the VA pod, we had prepared a PDF version of the questionnaire. And basically, this is just a sample example. This is not a real document, but really representative of what it would look like. And then a person can just fill the PDF form with their data and enter it. And so now, one interface of the service is rather than consuming the input from the HTML form, I can specify to the service to consume an XML file, a JSON file, and a PDF file. When I do that, I can then just choose a file. And let's say I pick Mary Stern here as the file. And let me show you what Mary Stern is. So here's Mary Stern form and how she filled it up. So she filled up her form this way. And now when the form is consumed by the same service, it finds that Mary is not suicidal. She has a mild depression, and that I should consider referring her to her primary care physician or a psychiatrist. And that when I go to do that, after that, we end in the state to rescreen her in 2 to 4 weeks. So now I can, again, reconsume the service in PDF. And let me this time choose Jovetsu. And let me show you Jovetsu's answer. And by now, you know that he's finding things and I have thoughts of hurting himself. Excuse me. So in the case of Jovetsu, when I run this on the PDF form that he submitted, right away, I get that he's suicidal with moderate depression and I should get immediate psychological consultation. So what's really interesting here is that we have a single service, a single encapsulation of the logic that is both the documentation, the narrative for that clinical guidelines, the decision logic, and this service is exposed as a microservice that can be containerized, and that microservice can be consumed from all kinds of different endpoints, either from form, from an open API, from a REST API, or even from a CDS hook, always running the same service. And as Steve mentioned, in the background, we can log all these different calls, and we can see for each of these calls, you know, what was the answer that was provided to the various questions, and what was the result that was returned in a machine consumable way again. So again, we have a trace, a log of all this, and as Steve alluded, we can mine all this data and extract a lot of very valuable information about what's going on. Now, Steve, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, Denis, I think you've covered it. But happy to entertain questions from the participants.
Yeah. So if we have any question, Tracy, we're ready to take questions.
We do. We have one in the queue. Now's a good time if anyone on the line has questions. First question here. Understanding PHQ-9 is free. At BPM Plus Health, are you seeing any organizations convert any of their licensed assessments, algorithms, or instruments to BPMN? Are there any central libraries of these assessments being built and exposed for consumption via BPM Plus?
Yes, in fact, there's a library, an open library at cds.trisotech.com, and if you go there, there's a library of over 800 models, BPMN, DMN model, that are available on a series of different type of grouping of issues. So under different moniker here, you can find things that relate to appendicitis or asthma, etc. And there's different models available there, and these can be consumed. Right now, all these models are in a beta environment that we call it. So we're exploring and learning how to better fit it to the different consumption environment. So anybody is welcome to go to that endpoint, get access, and consume these various services and provide us with feedback or improvement, various services that they think we should have in the library there.
Thanks, Denis. Is there any functionality to visualize the stored data or analyze the stored data?
So there is no, So this is working in mostly in a stateless or partly stateful environment that is, as Steve was mentioning, anonymized so that we only have what the answers was to the call of the service, and we can only provide what the result was. So yes, this information is a log, but it's a log that you have to actually start. So I did before this, but I could also see laws about the data and what data is used and consumed.
Of the models.
So BPM Plus itself doesn't model the own, belongs to the people that create the model, and it's up to to decide how they want to handle this intellectual property. Some of them will make it openly available for consumption by anyone. Some people may choose to only have the service or the API consumable by people freely. And some organization may choose to actually create a pay-for-play type of model. So some companies or some association, for example, they decide that they will charge consumption or even the reading of these models, and others may choose to make them open. It's totally up to the author, and because it's an open standard, there's no obligation towards the BPM Plus community from the authors.
Right.
Yeah, Denis, if I could just add to that a little bit. It's a really interesting question, and I can tell you that professional societies are dealing with this in frankly, very different ways. ACOG is very kind of concerned about licensing and ownership and kind of keeping a tight grip on these kind of things. On the other hand, there are other professional societies who say, wait a minute, we're here for the good of the community. We want care to be better, and we're going to make these models available on an open source basis. So I think how to get these things into prod, we're still in infancy right now. That we're just going to have to throw a lot of jello on the wall and see what sticks here. But different professional societies are certainly looking at this in very different ways.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, well, we went through our queue of questions. Presentation was very good. Thank you, guys. And thanks for everybody that tuned in this afternoon. We are capturing the recordings from the presentations. This is presentation 3 from today. Tomorrow, Thursday, we have 5 more sessions. If you want to take a look at that schedule, there's a link in the chat box to our page on the BPM Plus Health website where you can see the sessions we have lined up for tomorrow afternoon Eastern time. First one starts at noon time. So we look forward to seeing you on there tomorrow. And don't hesitate to reach out at any time if you have any more questions, and visit our site if you'd like to get involved in some of our working groups. The authoring work group specifically that Steve was mentioning is the group that's authoring these guidelines and turning them into models. So, but Denis and Steve, thanks again, and everyone have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.